Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Ashbrook Center for inviting me here and thank Ben for that introduction. I would note that although most of the television shows that he listed that I'd appeared on are no longer in existence, in this case, I am pretty sure that correlation does not imply causation, but I suppose you can be the judge of that after I'm done. Thank you all for coming out here, as they say on the airlines these days. I know you had other options. I'm especially gratified to see so many young people here. Young people, you are our hope for the future, which also, by the way, logically implies that you could be the final ruin of this great republic. Up to you. Not since the inauguration of Andrew Jackson has the arrival of a new president in Washington been the source of as much popular enthusiasm as greeted Barack Obama in January of 2009. Liberal Democrats were naturally the most joyful of the celebrators, but they were enveloped in a supportive and hopeful national mood. Even though it's been less than 3 years, that time seems impossibly far off today. Just to try to recapture it in our memories, let me mention one of the telling cultural productions of the moment. The soprano Renee Fleming sang an Obama-fied Christmas carol at the time. In the bleak midwinter at the Christmas feast, a family leaves Chicago and travels to the east. You may recall that the original starred the Christ child. Well, like Andrew Jackson, Obama represented another stage in the country's democratization. Unlike his predecessors, Jackson was not from the founding generation, not related to a founder, not a member of the Virginia dynasty. He embodied the Western future of the country, just as Obama does our multiracial future. At least this time, we can take consolation in that the partiers did not take over the White House and force the new president to seek lodging elsewhere on his first night of office, as happened in 1829. Liberals, for their part, were confident that small government conservatism had been discredited by the financial crisis, confident as well that demographic change and the public turn against George W. Bush was important of a left turn that would last for at least a generation, and confident finally that their new leader could get past any bumps in the road through the power of his charisma and his oratory. In Obama, liberalism had found its Reagan, or rather its anti-Reagan, the man who could bring down the curtain on the conservative era that the 40th president had inaugurated. Sam Tannenhouse of the New York Times wrote a book on the death of conservatism. Time magazine ran a cover story on whether the Republican Party was going extinct. And James Carville wrote a book called 40 More Years that promised, well, I won't spoil it for you. I don't think it'll be controversial to observe that that rosy glow has now faded from Obama. Its dimming was inevitable for 3 reasons. First, Obama's appeal rested in important part on glamour, the essence of which is mystery. He has become familiar, and in some ways over-familiar, since then. What once struck many people as ennobling exhortations now seems a lot like hectoring. Second, his vague positioning was bound to disappoint people who had, as Obama himself observed in the preface to The Audacity of Hope, projected their views onto him. Both people to his left and the much larger group of people to his right did this and were disappointed when they learned that those projections were in vain. But it's the third reason for Obama's fall from political heaven that concerns us today, the dismal performance of the economy. The weak economy has lingered like an uninvited guest at the liberal replay of Camelot. The liberal confidence of early 2009, remember, was not merely political, as with James Carville, and not merely personal, as with Obama himself, although it must be said that in self-confidence the man had very much met the moment. Liberals also had an intellectual and programmatic confidence. They were sure that they knew how to combat the recession. So, for example, one writer for the liberal New Republic nicely encapsulated the prevailing liberal view when he remarked that the stimulus debate concerned, quote, an engineering question with, quote, an objectively right answer. And he added, there really isn't much debate about this among economists. Never mind Robert Barrow, Martin Feldstein, Greg Mankiw, Gary Becker, Ed Prescott, James Buchanan, Michael Boskin, all of them distinguished economists, some boasting Nobel Prizes, who either rejected stimulus in toto or considered the democratic version of it badly flawed. Liberals were confident as well that they knew how to control healthcare costs. Peter Orszag, Obama's first budget director, was convinced that the clever management of federal spending on healthcare programs could be leveraged to drive efficiency gains throughout the healthcare sector. Now, this approach has a track record of some 30 years of unrelieved failure, but presumably nobody as bright as Obama and Orszag had been in charge before. Don't misconstrue me. Both of them are quite bright as far as I can tell. My point is rather that it may be that no human being is smart enough to do what they want government officials to do. Contemporary liberalism is suffused with hubris. It rests on the assumption that enlightened administrators can systematically achieve better results than the decentralized wisdom embodied by tradition or produced by the market. But at least liberals' political confidence is now chastened as they contemplate the results of the 2010 elections and the possible results of the next set of elections. I submit that perhaps the administration's economic record should give those liberals reason to consider whether their intellectual confidence is also unwarranted. Now, it should be conceded at the outset that some of the attacks on Obama's economic stewardship are unfair. Presidents don't create economic conditions, and the assumption that they do is infantile. At the same time, it's not unreasonable for the public to use the economy as the most objective measure available, even if a rough one, to hold presidents accountable. The unfairness of it has redounded to liberals' credit as often as to their discredit over the years, or even more often. Next year will be the first time that the politics of the economy has clearly helped a Republican presidential candidate since 1988. And if economic conditions were cheerful, nobody doubts what the message from the Democratic Party would be right now. But to return to the merits rather than to politics, the administration and its supporters are quite right to say that we don't know how the economy would have performed under different policies. We can't know the counterfactual case. The administration notoriously sold its stimulus legislation with a graph warning how high the unemployment rate would be without its passage, only to find the unemployment rate going even higher than that worst-case prediction after its passage. What the administration's defenders now say is that their error was not in overestimating the positive effects of the stimulus. Rather, they say, they underestimated the severity of the recession, and that may well be true. What we should all be able to agree on is that however much responsibility we assign for the conditions we now face to the Obama administration's policies, those conditions are dreadful. Economist Kevin Hassett recently wrote, "Since World War II, high unemployment has been extraordinarily rare in the United States. Between 1948 and 1982, the unemployment rate never climbed above 9%. It hit that rate during the early 1980s recession as the Federal Reserve wrung double-digit inflation out of the economy. But it didn't reach those heights again until the last few years." The effects of prolonged unemployment ramify for years. When unemployment remains elevated for long periods of time, the percentage of people who are unemployed for a long time also rises. Currently, half the unemployed have been unemployed for more than 6 months. The number of people who drop out of the labor force altogether by ceasing to look for work also rises. And we know that the longer someone is out of a job, and especially the longer someone is out of the labor force, the harder it is for him to ever find a job. This is a particularly acute problem for older workers who have a harder time getting rehired than younger ones. But the social implications may be worse for young people, especially young people without college degrees, for whom persistent unemployment is hard to recover from. It makes it harder as well to form and sustain stable families, which creates problems for children yet unborn. And severe economic contractions leave their marks even on those fortunate enough to find steady employment eventually. People who finish school during recessions have lower lifetime earnings than people who are graduated during booms. The statistics suggest that their wages are still a little bit lower at the end of their working lives than they would have been if the timing had been different. Sorry to tell you all that. The Obama administration's approach to this economic calamity has been fundamentally misguided. Here is the president speaking in February 2009, just a few weeks into his term. The fact is, our economy did not fall into decline overnight, he said. Now is the time to invest in areas like energy, healthcare, and education that will grow our economy. In other words, it just so happened that the policy response required by the economic crisis was the implementation of the entire liberal wish list of the last generation. It would have been an extraordinary coincidence if this were the case. And a moment's thought should have been enough to expose the folly of this analysis. European countries, where much of that agenda had already been implemented, where there are caps on carbon emissions, where there are national healthcare systems, had suffered from the financial crisis as well, and in some cases had suffered worse than we have. The centerpiece of the administration's agenda was, of course, a Keynesian stimulus. While stimulus supporters, such as Paul Krugman, insist the stimulus was much too small, it was quite large both by the standards of U.S. history and the policies of other developed countries affected by the crisis. Supporters of the stimulus have cited two types of studies to back their contention that it made the economy better than it otherwise would have been. By far the most common type of study has simply input the numbers of the stimulus to models that assume that $1 of spending will have a specified multiplier effect on economic activity, and then, with that model, they've generated the conclusion that the legislation created so many jobs and this much extra income. Well, this type of proof is, of course, nothing of the sort. It amounts to saying that if you assume that the stimulus worked, the stimulus worked. Then there are the allegedly empirical proofs of the efficacy of stimulus. For example, economists have found that economic activity was higher in states that received more stimulus money than in states that received less stimulus money, and that's true even after you control for other variables. And that's a result that Krugman, for example, trumpeted in the New York Times. But to cite this evidence is to fall prey to what logicians call the fallacy of composition. No sane person doubts that if the federal government decided to enact a stimulus package consisting of $10 billion in payments to me, the income of my suddenly enlarged staff and the restaurants I frequent would increase. The question is whether total economic activity in the nation would increase as well, or merely my share of it. The studies can't answer that question, although by all means, Congress should act hastily on this legislation to let us test the question. I believe there's a powerful theoretical reason for thinking that the true multiplier effect of stimulus spending must be at a maximum 0. If one assumes, uncontroversially, that the Federal Reserve loosens monetary policy whenever it perceives inflation and economic output to be too low, and tightens it whenever they're dangerously high, then any fiscal stimulus must be offset by reduced monetary ease or increased monetary tightness. In other words, if there had been no stimulus bill in 2009, the Fed would have loosened monetary policy more in order to hit its inflation and output targets. It follows that fiscal stimulus cannot increase the total amount of economic activity, but can merely shift it around, and in particular, shift it from the private to the public sector. If stimulus spending increases the nation's productive capacity, as liberals say it does with respect to, for example, infrastructure spending, then perhaps it has a positive impact in the long run. But even if the spending is wise, the short-run stimulative effect it is supposed to produce cannot materialize. And there is ample reason to be skeptical even of the long-term claims. By now, many Americans have learned that when politicians talk about green jobs, it is time to reach for your wallet. The phrase has always sounded to me like a promise that in the future we will all get rich by cleaning up after each other. There are only two possible outcomes of green industrial subsidies. They may go to lines of economic development that pass a market test and thus would have materialized anyway, in which case they are a waste of taxpayer money. Or they may go to lines of development that can't pass a market test and thus shouldn't have materialized, in which case they are also a waste of money. Thus, it is not surprising that the headlines surrounding green jobs have gotten grimmer and grimmer, leaving aside the scandals that inevitably accompany political allocations of resources. The Washington Post recently reported that in the first 2 years of stimulus spending, 3,500 green jobs were created out of a promised 65,000 jobs. So off by, well, I'll let Joe Biden do the math. Subsidies for higher education, with all due respect to my host, are also a questionable economic growth strategy. Politicians in both parties like to cite statistics that show that college graduates make a lot more money than non-graduates, but it doesn't follow that we should therefore try to get more people to go to college. For one thing, the fact that 40% of kids who enroll in college do not get a degree within 6 years suggests that we have already maxed out on that strategy. It's been estimated that in 2007, before the recession hit, most people in their 20s who had college degrees were not in jobs that required them. Another sign that we are pushing kids into college who will not get much out of it but debt. Part of the college wage premium is an illusion. People who go to college are, on average, and with certain exceptions, which I can name some of them from my own class, smarter than people who don't. In an economy that increasingly rewards intelligence, you would expect college grads to pull ahead of the pack, even if their diplomas signified nothing but what it took to get in. College must make students more productive workers in some cases, but at least some of the apparent value of a college degree, and maybe a lot of it, reflects the fact that employers can use a diploma as a rough measure of job applicants' intelligence and willingness to work. The long-term costs of higher spending in general should also be taken into account when doing a full assessment of whether this spending is efficacious. It's been estimated that every 10-point increase in the ratio of government spending to the size of the economy, that is to say when you go from 20% ratio of government spending to GDP to 30%, decreases economic growth by 1% a year. And over time that adds up, or rather compounds, to make a big difference in living standards. We also know that increasing the ratio of federal debt to the size of the economy reduces growth, and current policy do of those things. The administration's second most important economic initiative after the stimulus was its health care legislation. Throughout the debate, the president and his allies insisted that it would promote the competitiveness of American companies by reducing the cost of health care. As I've mentioned, the theory on which these hopes for reducing costs rest is dubious. It's already been tried and failed. But even if it succeeded, the administration is wrong to think that reducing healthcare costs would help American businesses compete with foreign rivals. The Congressional Budget Office, even under the control of the president's party during the healthcare debate, exposed the flaw in this argument when it noted that healthcare costs come out of compensation, not profits. Lower healthcare costs would change the mix of wages and benefits, and I'll return to that later, but it wouldn't change the total amount of employee compensation. A survey of healthcare economists found no proposition in the field that met with greater agreement. The legislation also has two features that will inflict serious economic damage. It offers subsidies for the purchase of health insurance, but reduces those subsidies as people climb the economic ladder, and does so in a way that imposes an extremely high effective marginal tax rate on people who are poor or lower middle class. Getting raises will not be worthwhile for them, and that's got to affect labor effort. The legislation also effectively shuts the door on Medicare reform by creating a board that has the power to save money by imposing price controls and taking steps toward rationing, but cannot, by law, recommend structural changes such as increased deductibles and copays, the kinds of structural changes that might actually lead to real long-term savings. On regulation, the administration says it's being reasonable and measured, and with great fanfare, its point man on the issue, Cass Sunstein, announced that the administration will not treat spilled milk on dairy farms as the equivalent of an oil spill. As grateful as we all are for that forbearance, it must be noted that the staffing of regulatory agencies is up by 13% under this administration, and the budgets of regulatory agencies are up by 16%. This sector of the economy, at least, is booming, and President Obama can take full credit for it. The Small Business Administration estimated that the gross cost of federal regulation in 2008 was $1.75 trillion. That cost has surely increased under President Obama. Well, can it be said that Obama's agenda includes other items that would have helped the economy, but were not passed because of opposition? In a word, no. The claims that a cap-and-trade program on carbon emissions would help the economy are frankly ludicrous. The Department of Energy has calculated that the costs of such a program would be $444 billion through 2030. And that is with the aid of heroically optimistic assumptions. To quote one of those assumptions, key low-emissions technologies will be developed and deployed in a time frame consistent with requirements and encounter no major obstacles. Believe that who will. My colleague Jim Manzi, working from the data and assumptions of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and of Yale professor William Nordhaus, who's respected by all sides of the debate, has concluded that a worldwide program to reduce carbon emissions that was perfectly designed and implemented would yield a net benefit of 0.17% of the present value of global GDP over the next several centuries. Most of that net benefit would not accrue to Americans. Relax those assumptions. For example, account for the side deals necessary to keep coal country senators or 2.5 billion Asians on board with the program, and that number would surely turn negative. The other major liberal initiative that Democrats failed to pass, even with lopsided control of Congress and a friendly president in 2009 and 2010, was card check, which would have effectively abolished the secret ballot in elections to unionize workforces. In a study of the Canadian experience with card check, economist Susan Johnson found that it would indeed have had its intended effect of increasing rates of unionization. But as Obama advisor Larry Summers wrote when he was still an academic and thus could afford to tell the truth, unionization is a contributing factor to long-term unemployment. The labor movement has embraced an elaborate mythology about the reasons for its decades-long decline, one heavy with melodrama involving ruthless union-busting employers and the venal politicians who enabled their depredations, notably including Ronald Reagan. In reality, changes in labor law and its enforcement have not played a major role in that decline, nor is the reason for that decline primarily a shift in the economy away from sectors that were heavily unionized, such as manufacturing. And in fact, the non-unionized manufacturing workforce has actually increased. It increased by 1.5 million people between 1973 and 2006. No, the real primary reason why unions have declined as a share of the private sector workforce is that unionized companies were systematically unable to compete with non-unionized companies. 80% of the decline can thus be explained, and liberals can't reverse this trend. One last unrealized economic policy ambition of the Obama administration deserves mention, and that is the drive to increase tax rates on high earners. Its defenders say that they would merely bring back the tax rates of the 1990s, which of course saw rapid economic growth. Actually, the rates would be at least slightly higher than that, but it's true that in the 90s, higher rates proved compatible with higher growth. But if you live by the counterfactual, you have to die by it too, and we can't know what growth would have been if the other conditions of the 1990s had obtained, but we had lower tax rates. Today, we can say that we have more adverse technological and demographic circumstances than we enjoyed during the 1990s. And we should also note that the tax increases we're talking about would come before any deals to fix Social Security and Medicare, deals that would involve piling on still more taxes if the administration had its way. Well, so much then for the administration's economic agenda. There remains a reckoning with what it has left undone. And to my mind, the great missed opportunity of this administration came in monetary policy. We overestimate the extent to which the housing bust contributed to our problems. Recall that residential construction employment started falling long before the crisis hit without having a major impact on the unemployment rate. And at the same time, we underestimate the extent to which the Federal Reserve is responsible for the slump. We now know that the recession began in December 2007, and the Federal Reserve didn't take decisive action, in part because in the middle of 2008, it allowed fears of rising commodity prices, especially oil, to make it worry that easier money would generate an unacceptably high level of inflation. Then in the fall of 2008, when the financial crisis hit, most government officials were essentially broadcasting to the American people the message that now was the time to panic. Americans grew uncertain and scared and reacted by increasing their demand for liquid assets, including money balances. When the demand for money balances rises, the appropriate response for the Fed is to raise the supply of money. But the Fed's efforts in this regard were wholly inadequate. Essentially, they recapitalized the banks and stopped there. And that those efforts were inadequate can be seen by looking at the national income statistics. Between 1982 and 2007, the period of time that economists have taken to calling the Great Moderation, when the business cycle seemed to be tame, when recessions were less frequent and less severe, the size of the economy grew fairly steadily at an average rate of about 5% a year, made up of about 3% real economic growth and 2% inflation. Some years you'd see higher than 5% growth and some years lower, but you stayed pretty close to that trend line, until that is the fall of 2008, when nominal income fell at the fastest rate since 1938. And that inflation that the Fed had been worried about, not only did it not materialize, but inflation actually turned negative. When the supply of money drops relative to demand, prices have to fall. That includes wages, but economists know that wages especially and prices in general don't adjust automatically or painlessly to this kind of demand shock, and that means that output drops. And when output drops, employment drops. And that's not all. People, businesses, and institutions that contracted debts during the Great Moderation with a reasonable assumption that the economy would continue to grow at roughly the same 5% clip it had been growing, something that's entirely within the power of the Federal Reserve to make happen, suddenly found the burden of those debts much higher than they had expected. The Fed's stop and start moves since then toward easier money have not moved us anywhere close to our previous trend line and have themselves become a powerful source of the uncertainty that makes it hard for private economic actors to plan and to coordinate their plans, that makes it hard, that is, for the market to do its work. And some members of the Fed remain worried that any more substantial and sustained move will reignite inflation, even though inflation remains well below its average rate over the last few decades. We therefore face not only a social catastrophe, but an entirely avoidable one. It should be admitted that on these issues, the president's Republican opposition is enthralled to worse and more destructive ideas than even the ones he holds. Monetary policy must, however, still be counted against this administration's record. Had the president supported and encouraged the Federal Reserve to do the right thing in 2009 and 2010, had he merely made wise appointments to its board in a timely manner when their confirmation was assured, he could have made an enormous difference. Lost opportunity may indeed be the theme of this administration. A lost opportunity to put our economic policy on a sound footing, to modernize our welfare state, perhaps even to calm our sometimes inflamed politics. But this country has a way of making new opportunities, and the title of this speech is Beyond Obamanomics, after all. So let me sketch an agenda that holds a little bit more promise than the administration's continued flailing about, and I promise to be brief here, to be at least as vague as a presidential candidate. First, as I've suggested, and above all, to hasten and safeguard the recovery, we need a monetary reform that commits the Federal Reserve to a rule that is conducive to economic stability. Our monetary policy ought to be governed by law, not men, and it ought to be predictable. That rule, in my view, ought to require the Federal Reserve to aim for a target for nominal income and be held accountable for hitting that target. Second, we need entitlement reforms that bring federal commitments to an affordable level, keep the tax burden low, and encourage saving. Third, we should reform taxes in order to lower rates, improve long-term growth, simplify the code, and offer relief for parents. Fourth, and in another step toward higher long-term growth, we should cut the corporate tax rate. Among developed countries, only Japan currently has a higher statutory rate, and they've been seriously considering cutting theirs to a level below ours. Even accounting for the loopholes with which our corporate tax code is rife, the effective tax rate on new investments or on expansions of old investments is quite high. Research suggests that countries with high corporate tax rates lose investment to countries with low ones, and over time, less investment in America leads to lower wages in America. Several studies now conclude that the corporate tax costs American workers more in wages, from 2 to 4 times more than it raises in revenues. Fifth, we need healthcare reform to bring back wage growth. During the last decade, even during the years when the economy was growing, ordinary workers in the middle of the income distribution, saw their wages stagnate, and the reason for that was that rising health insurance premiums ate up what otherwise would have been raises. We can change tax policy in a way that gives individuals more control over healthcare spending and eliminates the incentives that the tax code currently provides for healthcare inflation. And in both ways, we can improve growth rates for wages in the future. Sixth, I think, and this is something I think that needs to mostly happen at the state level, although there is a role for federal policy as well, we need some higher education reform. And our goal should be to create opportunities for people to advance and to make their way in the world without having to spend 4 years at a traditional bricks and mortar institution. That can mean increasing opportunities for online learning. It can mean cutting back on some of the ridiculous licensure regulations that too many states and localities have adopted. And seventh, it's time for regulatory moratorium. If we've gotten by without these regulations for this long, surely we can wait until unemployment has dropped back down to a normal level before imposing a new one. We could at least end the kind of regulatory autopilot that agencies tend to go on when they are left to their own devices, and say that if there is to be any new regulation, it should be as a result of a congressional enactment in response to some perceived emergency. Well, you'll notice that this agenda, as sketchy as it is, combines several elements. None of them assume that we should rely on the intelligent managers in Washington, D.C. to fix American health care or to identify the industries of the future. It's an agenda that has several characteristics in common. It is modest, but it is feasible. It is constitutional, and it is in keeping with the best traditions of America and our finest principles. And in each and every one of those respects, I would suggest it is the direct opposite of everything that characterizes this administration. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Can you hear me? No? Yes? Now? I have to bite the thing? Okay, I'll do it. I have to put my glasses on to read anything. He'll find out how this goes in another 30 years. First question, what one or two economic reforms could a new president, and presumably a Republican Congress, enact to improve the economy?
Well, I think some things can be done by executive order. I think, for example, the regulatory moratorium is at least you could say that unless absolutely directed to by statute, agencies should call a halt to these regulations. In general, though, I do think you are going to need congressional legislation, and that's a good thing. I don't think actually we should rely too heavily on action by the president alone, which is, I think, what we are increasingly going to see from this administration going forward now that it doesn't have a pliant Congress. And, look, I expect if there is a Republican presidential win, I think it likely means that there is at least nominal Republican control of the Senate and very likely Republican retention of the House. And so I do think you have a working majority that is capable of getting some conservative reforms through. And I would say tax reform and health care reform in particular ought to be very high on the list. And then entitlement reform will be a tougher climb, but I think is absolutely indispensable and unavoidable.
Thank you. Now that Kane is in the press for all the wrong reasons and Perry has slipped in the polls, is Mitt Romney the presumptive candidate for the Republicans, in your opinion?
I think it's going to be awfully hard to defeat Governor Romney at this point. I think that the primaries have a way of surprising you. There'll be some state that he thought he was going to win that he doesn't, and there'll be a momentary scare. But I think he's got the momentum and the residual strength that he can ride out some momentary defeats. And so, yes, I do think actually that he is the very likely the nominee. I think in some ways it ends up being like the 1992 presidential primaries for the Democrats, in which all the important action took place before anybody had cast a vote. I mean, if you recall then, you have this spectacle of one elder statesman of the Democratic Party after another declining a run, most famously Mario Cuomo, but also Sam Nunn and even Al Gore. And I think you guys saw something very similar take place in the Republican Party over the last year. So, you know, for a variety of reasons, yeah, I think Governor Romney is sitting pretty.
Oddly, this question relates to the last couple of sentences. Why have there not been some more serious Republican candidates in the primary? I mean, what's the explanation for that?
Well, you know, that's a tough question. I think in part because the back-to-back electoral disasters for the Republican Party in 2006 and 2008 left the bench pretty open. You know, I mean, if you recall, people in 2005 thought that George Allen, I mean, the sort of the establishment Republican candidates who were thought of as the front runners for the next nomination were George Allen and Bill Frist. And by the time the 2008 election rolled around, not only were neither of them candidates, neither of them were even in federal office anymore. So that's part of it. I think partly Romney sort of crowded out, just through his financial power, through, you know, the network that he'd built nationally, crowded out a bunch of other possible establishment candidates. And the portion of the primary electorate that is conservative and is not attracted to establishment-oriented candidates, is in fact sort of repelled by them, has a weakness for no-hope candidates, and spends a lot of time flirting with one no-hope candidate after another, which means you can't actually assemble a winning majority. You know, so every time Michelle Bachmann or Herman Cain has done well over the last couple months, I think it has been an objectively pro-Romney development. And, you know, so he's benefited from that. There's a reason why the party establishment candidate usually wins the presidential nomination. And it's because the conservatives who don't like the establishment candidate generally don't unify behind anybody credible. And I think you see that pattern happening this time as well.
Well, if I may follow that up. Well, if that's true, then of course the Republicans will lose the presidency.
No, I don't believe that's true, actually. Look, I mean, Governor Romney is, I mean, the funny thing about the way this race has shaped up is Governor Romney was sort of running as the movement conservative candidate in 2008. And this time around, he's stylistically running as the establishment's man. But if you look at his actual policy positions, on no issue has he moved left since 2007 and 2008, and on several issues he's actually moved rightward. I mean, for example, he is, you know, the pledge to cap federal spending at 20% of GDP is something that's new. He didn't run on that in 2007, 2008. I think he will be quite conservative enough to retain conservative support going into the fall of next year. But I mean, you know, I do actually. What I detect on the part of a lot of my fellow conservatives is not worry that he's doomed. It's a complacency that President Obama is a sure loser, which I also don't believe. I think this is very much an election up for grabs. I think that, and in a lot of ways, actually, what it reminds me of is the 2004 election, where, you know, you had this unusual situation where President Bush manages to win re-election even though his job approval rating is below 50%. But he manages to get a crucial sliver of the vote that is made up of voters who don't approve of the job he's doing but still prefer him to John Kerry. And I expect Obama to do a very negative line of attack against the Republicans. And I actually don't think in a way it matters which nominee the Republicans put up. I think the attack is very much kind of interchangeable regardless of who it is. And the goal is going to be to exactly have some people say, well, he hasn't been up to the job. He may be a failure, but those other guys are scary. And he's going to try to win re-election that way. And I don't, by any means, think that is beyond reach for him. I think it's absolutely doable.
assuming that he doesn't win re-election, what will President Obama's effect be on the Democratic Party? And the second question having to do with that is it possible that Secretary of State Clinton will take him on in whatever primaries might be left when she makes that decision?
No, there's going to be no primary challenge to Barack Obama, no serious primary challenge to him. There never was going to be any serious primary challenge to him. You know, the funny thing is there's a lot of chatter about liberal dissatisfaction with President Obama and his various compromises. But if you look, you know, if you look away from chattering class liberals to actual voting liberals, he's got a very high approval rating. He's got about 85% approval from the core Democratic base. He still obviously can count on a very solid black vote for him. There is just no room for any primary challenge to him. And I don't know why people waste their time speculating about it. Hillary Clinton, you know, I guess when people, that's the first time anybody's asked me sort of what Obama's effect on the Democratic Party will be if he loses. And I'm kind of happy to start thinking about that in November 2012. Let's wait and see if it happens. But I mean, I suppose my early guess would be that the verdict on him among Democrats will be he was handed a golden opportunity and he threw it away. And my second guess would be that their reaction is going to be not that he failed because he was too far left, but that he failed because he wasn't left enough. And they'll conclude that not because any data or evidence from the real world inclines that way, but because it's the most comfortable and pleasing thing for them to believe.
Thank you. This is a slight turn. The question reads, now that the U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to decide on the constitutionality of the federal health care, would you care to predict how they'll come out on it and even go into detail on who will vote for it, against it? How will Roberts vote, for example? And then last question, can the health care mandate live without the individual mandate?
Right. Would I care to predict how the Supreme Court will rule on the individual mandate in Obamacare? No. Next question? No. Look, I think the range of possible outcomes are either there are between 4 and 7 votes for upholding the mandate. That is, if it gets struck down 5-4 with the Republican bloc voting to strike it down. If it gets upheld, then you could see either Kennedy or Roberts or Scalia or Alito or some combination of them voting to uphold it. You know, there's certainly some of the past case law, some of Scalia's past decisions suggest that he is going to be open to the argument that while he thinks this is a bad idea as a policy matter, that it's just not the judicial role to say that it exceeds the Commerce Clause or necessary and proper powers of the Congress. And in general, my view on this has always been put not your faith in courts, that it is the political struggle against Obamacare to which we should primarily attend. And you know, one thing that I think people, including conservatives, often misunderstand about these issues, it is true that for 120, 130 years of American life, nothing like Obamacare was even remotely contemplated by America's political class. It wasn't even within the realm of discussion as something that was constitutional. But the main reason we had a government that largely respected constitutional limits was not that we had federal courts that imposed limits on the Commerce Clause or that applied the 10th Amendment. It's because we had precisely a robust constitutionalist political culture, and that's what we need to rebuild in this country. The courts are part of that, but they're only part of that. And in the long run, we can't count on the courts to protect our freedoms if we don't have that kind of political culture. End of sermon.
It's a good note to end on. Thank you very much for coming.
You're welcome.